It was a daily habit, until one day the pages stopped. Welcome to Crimson Clues. I am your host, Antonio. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'm always curious. I treasure every message you leave. Let's uncover the truth. It is one of the great consolations of the English upper classes that they may die surrounded by azaleas. It was during such a season, in the midst of budding promise, church fetes, and uncomfortable garden furniture, that Lord Peter Wimsey, returning from an ill-advised weekend of amateur bell-ringing in Gloucestershire, found himself marooned in the deceptively placid village of Cuffnell St. Jude. "Blame the axle," he told the curate's wife, who had kindly provided him with weak tea and a stiffer judgment. It gave a rather operatic creak, and then flung itself into mechanical despair, perhaps in sympathy with my efforts at the tenor bell. It was, however, not the axle but the diary that interested Lord Peter by tea-time. The business began with Miss Anthea Forrest's demise, a spinster of 57, with an unrelenting fondness for tidy hedges and damp scones. Miss Forrest had been found dead at her escritoire, head bent as though still reading, her spectacles neatly folded beside her diary, April 28th, underlined, with a finality that now seemed somewhat poetic. It was May 6th. The physician, a dry-mouthed man with tremulous fingers and opinions about tonic water, had declared it a stroke. Quick, painless, common enough at her age, the diary must have been the last thing she touched. "Which makes it," Lord Peter had murmured, "her literary swan song. Rather a shame it ends mid-sentence. No dying flourish, not even a farewell cruel world in Latin." The diary, left open on the desk, contained entries up to April 28th, a Sunday, with idle observations on the weather, a note about the vicar's sermon, meandering, and a cryptic mention. Mrs. D called again, odd turn of phrase, inherited shadow. The rest was blank. What piqued Wimsey's interest, however, was not merely the abrupt cessation of prose, nor even the rather ghoulish neatness of the scene, but the absence of a small, ornamental Persian cat. She called it Aristarchus, the housemaid had said, sniffling into her apron. Never left her side. He'd sit on her desk while she wrote, used to tap at the pen when he was cross. But he's gone. Just gone, my lord. And so, Wimsey mused, examining the pale smudge of cat fur still lingering on the blotter. The cat absconds, the diary ends, and Miss Forrest expires in an attitude of suspicious peace. A trifling matter, naturally. Cats are known escape. Artists and diaries have an inconvenient tendency to stop when the author does. Still, one wonders why Miss Forrest recorded her appointments in ink and her fears in metaphor. The constable, a rural model, heavy in boot and light in inference, had declared there was no evidence of foul play. Nor, added the vicar's wife with emphatic prudence, anything improper. Miss Forrest was a most respectable woman. "Respectability," said Wimsey, absently leafing through the diary's older entries, "is the perfect disguise for a secret. Rather like an umbrella stand that hides the murder weapon, or a vicar with a taste for Racine. Tell me, was she rich?" "Comfortably," said the curate, "but frugal. Never one for London fashions. She had a niece, I believe, in Dorset, and a cousin of some distinction who served in the colonial office. Cousins are such awkward things," said Wimsey. "They hover at the edges of wills and scandals, never quite disappearing." He closed the diary with a snap, eyes gleaming. "Bunter," he said, turning to his valet with the air of a man embarking on a hobby, "I believe we shall extend our stay. Do have a word with the innkeeper about rooms, preferably one without a floral carpet. There's something afoot in Cuffnell St. Jude, and I find myself unable to resist the invitation. After all, it's not every day one stumbles upon a death so symmetrical." And as Wimsey bent to examine a peculiar discoloration on the carpet near the escritoire, a faint smudge, as though something had been hastily cleaned. He smiled in that irritating, knowing way of his. "It's not the what, Bunter. It's the why not. Why not May? Why end the diary in April?" The parlour of the Rose and Teasel, the village's one respectable inn, was a dim affair with aggressively floral wallpaper and armchairs upholstered in something that had once aspired to burgundy. Lord Peter Wimsey occupied one such chair now, with the long, angled posture of a man both amused and alert. His legs were crossed, his fingers steepled, and he was studying a faint scratch on the brass fender with the same curiosity he had earlier afforded the deceased's diary. "Most odd," he said aloud, though Bunter, seated opposite with the parish records he'd discreetly acquired, knew better than to ask which part, or indeed whether anything at all had yet become unodd. Wimsey would explain only when it suited him, and never before the tea arrived. By the time the tray had been deposited, 2 cups, milk in first, no lemon, the first of Cuffnell St. Jude's domestic inhabitants was ushered in by the innkeeper's apologetic daughter, a housemaid named Elsie Carter, whose eyes were red and whose apron appeared freshly laundered solely for the occasion. "Please sit down, Miss Carter," said Wimsey with a polite nod. "We're merely having a quiet conversation about nothing at all, except perhaps the structure of a quiet life interrupted." "I don't know anything, my lord," she said immediately, twisting her fingers. "Miss Forrest was always kind to me, strict but proper. And I found her, so if you're thinking—" "No thoughts at all," said Wimsey lightly, "except that grief often clouds memory, and memory, when stirred, produces the most delightful sediment. Now, you said yesterday the cat, Aristarchus, was it, was missing. When did you last see him?" She blinked. "Oh, day before my lord. Saturday afternoon. He was sat on the window seat in the study, curled up tight. He always took the sun there. And on Sunday," she hesitated, "he weren't there or never seen again." I didn't see him. I thought maybe he'd gone to the garden, but Monday he didn't come for his milk, and by Tuesday I thought—" "Well, indeed," murmured Wimsey. "Cats vanish often, of course. But Miss Forrest was precise, rather like a clock, I imagine." Elsie gave a weak nod. "Everything done to time. Tea at 4, fire poked at 6, diary written just after supper. Always in her chair, always. She hated untidiness. So," Wimsey said, lifting his cup, "when you found her on Monday morning, how tidy was she?" There was a long pause. "Very, sir," she said at last, her voice small, "as if she hadn't moved at all since the night before. But no tray, no teacup, no supper remains? No, sir, nothing." "Fascinating," said Wimsey cheerfully, setting down the cup. "And the gardener, Mr. Latchley, is it? I'd very much like a word." He found Mr. Latchley in the potting shed, puffing foully on a pipe and polishing a pair of shears with the dedication of a man who found conversation disagreeable unless conducted with rose bushes. Wimsey's first few overtures were met with grunts, but the mention of Miss Forrest's death brought a suspicious gleam to his eye. "She never did take to people, you know. Kept herself in that house with the cat and her dried lavender. Walked round the garden like she was inspecting troops." "Did she say anything odd, Mr. Latchley?" "In the last week, perhaps." Latchley spat into a flower pot. "She was more cross than usual. Snapped at me Friday about the lilacs. Said they smelled wrong, lilacs, as if a flower could choose how to stink." "Odd indeed," murmured Wimsey. "And visitors?" "No one I saw. Though," he tapped his pipe against the pot rim, "someone came by Sunday evening. I was up at the shed mending that old bench. Heard the gate creak. Looked down and saw a car. Grey saloon, didn't know the make. Pull up to her drive. Only stayed 10-15 minutes. Did you see who got out?" "No, sir, just the car, but lights were on in her study, then off." "Curious," said Wimsey. "Did Miss Forrest usually receive guests so late?" "She didn't usually receive 'em at all." When he returned to the inn, Bunter was waiting with his usual crisp report. "There is a niece, my lord, Miss Ivy Forrest." Lives in Lyme Regis. Correspondence with her aunt was sparse but regular. Nothing appears amiss. Excellent. And the cousin? Bunter nodded. Colonel George Everett Forrest. Retired. Lives in Cheltenham. Distant by all accounts. Mentioned once or twice in the diary. More in reference than affection. And anything in the parish records? Bunter hesitated. There was a matter of some gossip in 1904, my lord. Miss Forrest was once engaged to a local solicitor, Mr. Bernard Maddox. The engagement was broken off after a scandal involving a contested will. Charming, said Wimsey. And what became of our romantic lawyer? Died in 1916. France. Wimsey turned that over in his mind. A broken engagement, a lonely spinster, a diary ending mid-thought. And a grey saloon seen the night before her death. I think it's time we spoke to the doctor again, he said. Dr. Prentice, summoned with a note and his usual complaint about stairs, arrived at the inn in a mood somewhere between professional obligation and reluctant curiosity. He was not used to being questioned. She had a weak heart, he said defensively. Age, stress likely triggered in the night, died peacefully. You saw no bruising, no marks? No. And I have no reason to suspect poisoning. Nothing in the teacup. There was no teacup. That's what troubles me, said Wimsey. Miss Forrest's habits were rigid. No tea before diary, yet no tea was present. And why write only half a sentence, then die? Strokes can do that. Indeed, said Wimsey. So can... Interruptions. Prentice frowned. You believe she was disturbed? I believe, said Wimsey, standing, that she may not have died Sunday night at all. He left the doctor in the parlour, speechless, and wandered upstairs to his room, whistling softly. Bunter followed. May I inquire what leads your lordship to that suggestion? Consider, Bunter, Wimsey said, untying his cravat with the air of a man solving a chess problem. If she died Sunday night, why no signs of the usual routine? No tray, no cat, no fire set, and the diary left open as if still in use. Yet no additions. Yes, my lord. But if she died earlier, say Saturday night, then the empty Sunday becomes an illusion. Someone might have entered, staged the scene, left the diary just so, perhaps even opened the curtains to suggest a morning death. But the doctor, based. His opinion on appearance, no autopsy, and Miss Forrest's body was chilled in a cold room with thick stone walls. A few hours' difference might not be noticed, especially if one assumes what one expects to see. Bunter inclined his head. Then the Sunday evening visitor may not have come to visit Miss Forrest at all, but to arrange her. As night fell over Cufnell St. Jude, Lord Peter stood at the window, gazing down at the church spire and the dim street lamp that flickered near the garden gate of the Forrest house. A grey saloon, he said aloud, an empty diary, a vanished cat. Bunter, we must find that vehicle. And perhaps we ought to speak to this niece, Ivy Forrest. I have the distinct feeling that someone's been rehearsing a part they hoped would go unnoticed. He smiled faintly, but they forgot to write the second act. The following morning brought rain, soft and apologetic, an English drizzle that draped itself over the thatched roofs of Cufnell St. Jude like a worn shawl. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, showed no signs of dampened enthusiasm as he crossed the cobbled square with the confident stride of a man whose mind had already leapt several moves ahead on the chessboard. At his side, Bunter held a waxed portfolio containing a typed list of all grey saloons, registered within a 15-mile radius, procured via a subtle combination of charm, rank, and the local postmistress's enthusiasm for anything resembling espionage. Wimsey glanced over the list as they walked, murmuring observations to the rhythm of his steps. 3 Austins, 2 Morris Oxfords, and a Rover with lapsed insurance. But this one, R.J. Crossley, chemist, Dorchester, drove through on Sunday evening, bought petrol here at the filling station, paid cash, left no name. Bunter offered no comment, merely opening an umbrella over them both as they approached the forest house, which loomed behind a screen of sodden laurel. The windows remained shuttered. The garden looked forlorn. Only the gate, newly oiled and, swinging slightly in the breeze, showed signs of recent interference. "Note the hinges," said Wimsey, inspecting them. "Fresh grease. Someone's been cautious, shall we?" He stepped through, boots brushing fallen lilac petals, and rapped gently at the door. After a pause, it was opened by the widow of the late vicar, a Mrs. Greaves, now performing the reluctant duty of caretaker. She was a pale woman with trembling hands and a voice that clung to its final consonants like ivy. "Oh, Lord Peter, I wasn't expecting anyone so early. I do apologize. I'm afraid logic keeps dreadful hours." "Might we come in?" She admitted them with the air of one expecting an accusation, not a question, and led them to the sitting room where Miss Forrest had spent most of her evenings. Wimsey glanced about. Everything remained as before, an aura of fixed order, the slight scent of beeswax and dried thyme. The hearth was cold, the clock on the mantel ticking with obstinate precision. "Tell me, Mrs. Greaves, did Miss Forrest ever speak to you of family troubles?" "Oh, no, my lord. She was never forthcoming in that way. She kept herself wrapped, like a letter she didn't intend to send. I do know she had high hopes for her niece Ivy, always sent her books, advised her on schooling, but I don't think they were close, not really." "Indeed. And did she seem, well, anxious in her final weeks?" Mrs. Greaves hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against curiosity. "Not anxious, no, but distracted. I saw her one morning standing at the back window, staring at the hedges. When I asked what she was thinking, she said, 'The shadow doesn't match the tree.' And then she smiled, my lord, smiled as though it were a joke she'd told herself and no one else could understand. Her curious remark. She always was a curious woman." Wimsey turned to the desk. The diary remained there, shut now, but clearly untouched. The blotter still bore the faint ghost of her last penned words. He opened the top drawer. Inside lay pens, some old correspondence, a pair of spectacles untouched. Yet something tugged at him. He drew out the ink bottle. Full, too full. "Bunter." "Yes, my lord." "Fetch me a sheet of paper." Wimsey dipped the pen, scribbled something, and nodded. "The ink is too fresh. This bottle was refilled very recently. Odd, isn't it? For a woman writing the final words of her life, whether she knew it or not, to take time to refill her ink. Unless, of course, someone else wrote them." He stood suddenly and walked to the hearth, where the grate held a scattering of grey ashes. He knelt. "Look here. Paper fibres, charred unevenly. Someone burned something in this grate, and recently." "A page from the diary?" asked Bunter. "Or several. Perhaps one's dated after April 28th, which begs the question, why preserve? That page and destroy the rest." Wimsey stood. "We must speak with Miss Ivy Forrest. Today." An hour later, a telephone call to Lyme Regis produced a polite voice with a flat southern accent. Miss Ivy Forrest, 26, worked as a secretary at a private clinic. She had been shocked to hear of her aunt's passing, regretted she had not visited more often, and would be pleased, but puzzled, to receive Lord Peter Wimsey at her flat. By 4 that afternoon the Daimler had reached Lyme Regis. Ivy Forrest received them in a modest second-floor flat above a greengrocer. She was small, composed, and wore her hair in a neat chignon. Her eyes were the only hint of emotion, sharp, guarded, a little too alert. "I'm afraid I don't know much about Aunt Anthea's affairs," she said, after tea had been offered and declined. "We weren't particularly close. I visited her once a year. She preferred letters. Did she ever mention trouble with anyone, legal matters, disagreements? No, never." Ivy sipped water from a thin glass. She wasn't the type to share. She liked control. And her will? I haven't seen it. I was told I might be named, but I don't know the details. Wimsey steepled his fingers. Your aunt's diary ended on April 28th, yet she was not found until Monday, May 6th. You never received a letter, a card, anything in that week? No. And you didn't visit her in April? No. I haven't been to Cuffmill St. Jude. Since Christmas? Quite. Wimsey leaned forward. And tell me, do you drive, Miss Forrester? She blinked. Yes, of course. May I ask the colour of your car? Grey? An Austin. Is that relevant? Only in so much as you're not the only person in possession of a grey car, he said lightly. But it is helpful. You see, someone in a grey saloon visited your aunt the night before her body was found, yet according to several details, ink, freshness, hearth ash, inconsistencies in routine, it's possible your aunt died before that evening. Which raises the intriguing possibility that someone staged the death scene to appear more recent. Perhaps to coincide with the diary's last entry. One wonders why. Ivy paused. You don't think I never think, said Wimsey airily. I only observe. For instance, I observe that you're left-handed, yet your aunt's diary is written with a right-handed slope. I observe also that you do not seem surprised by the idea of a staged scene, only by the suggestion it might involve you. You are clearly clever. Secretaries usually are, but cleverness without imagination often ends in ink. She said nothing for a moment, her knuckles pale around the glass. Then she stood. I didn't kill her. No, said Wimsey gently. I rather think someone else did that for you. But I do think you found her earlier than you said, and I think you made the scene look neater than death ever allows, to protect someone. Or yourself. She looked at him, eyes narrowed. You don't know anything. Not yet. But I shall. Because the shadow doesn't match the tree, Miss Forrest, and the diary doesn't match the truth. As they descended the stairs, Bunter glanced at his master. Do you believe her, my lord? I believe, said Wimsey, putting on his gloves, that Miss Ivy Forrest arrived on Sunday evening to find a corpse and a choice. What she did next, why she did it, may lie not in the will, but in the ashes we found. The question is, what was written between April 28th and May 6th that someone took such pains to destroy? They stepped into the drizzle once more, and Wimsey smiled faintly. Now we must find the solicitor, for where there's a will, Bunter, there's often an unwilling accomplice. The solicitor in question, a Mr. Oswald Belling of Belling, Trask and Belling, had an office that smelled of boiled linseed and the slow decay of precedent. Located in the square of Dorchester, the firm had served 3 generations of discreet rural aristocracy and their inevitable scandals. Its most current Belling was a gaunt man with a remarkable resemblance to a heron, who peered at Lord Peter Wimsey over pince-nez with the weary tolerance of one accustomed to clients in tweeds demanding impossible codicils. I was wondering when someone of your energetic temperament might call, he said, rising only slightly from his chair. Miss Forrest's death has stirred quite the draught through the upper filing cabinets. Wimsey removed his gloves and inclined his head. I do apologize, Mr. Belling. The dead do tend to inconvenience the living, especially when they possess both property and relatives. I believe you are the executor. I am, said Belling. Miss Forrest lodged her will with us 2 years ago. I handled the revisions myself. Revisions? A small one. She removed her cousin, Colonel Forrest, as a secondary beneficiary. Left everything to her niece, Miss Ivy Forrest, straightforward. Nothing for servants. A modest bequest to the housemaid, £40 and a silver brooch. The gardener receives nothing, but then he was only recently hired. Miss Forrest was precise but not sentimental. Wimsey nodded, lightly tapping his cane. May I ask, was there any ambiguity, that is, any uncertainty as to her state of Mind coercion or other legal worms? None whatever. I drafted it myself. She signed before witnesses. Her mind was sharp as a nail and twice as unforgiving. And the will has now been executed? Pending final certificate of death and probate, yes. Miss Ivy Forrest has been notified. The estate consists chiefly of the property, a few investment accounts and some heirlooms. Total value just under £9,000. A tidy sum, said Wimsey almost to himself. Mr. Belling, did Miss Forrest ever mention being threatened, harassed, concerned for her safety? Not in those terms, though she did make a remark when she last came in. I assumed it was metaphorical. Do share it. Metaphors are often dreadfully literal in hindsight. She said, when the past writes letters to the present, one must take care who holds the pen. Wimsey's eyes glinted. She said that? She did, rather bleakly. Then she asked if it was possible to disinherit a beneficiary who had already signed a confidentiality agreement. Was it? In theory, yes. In practice, she never followed through. Wimsey stood, brushing his coat sleeve. Mr. Belling, I rather suspect your client was afraid of something, or someone, and left us breadcrumbs in the form of poetic prose. Do you know if she kept copies of her will at home? She kept her duplicate in her desk drawer. I insisted on it. Then I wonder, said Wimsey with a narrow smile, which version the fire consumed. As they returned to the car, Bunter consulted his notes. The gardener, Latchley, was hired in January. Little record before then, local man, unmarried. And Miss Forrest's niece has a car, a motive and an alibi shaped like silence. What do we lack, Bunter? A means, said Bunter crisply, and a confirmation of time. Exactly, said Wimsey, tapping the roof of the Daimler. We must get inside that house again. Something was burned. But I don't believe it. Was only paper. They arrived back in Cuffnell St. Jude under a lowering sky. The Forrest house, still shuttered, seemed more mausoleum than home. With quiet efficiency, Wimsey produced the key, borrowed under vague pretense from the vicar's widow, and let them in. The air within was stale with absence. Wimsey went directly to the study. He examined the fireplace once more, this time with a small pocket magnifier. After a moment, he knelt and drew a pin from his lapel, carefully sifting through the grey remnants. His brow furrowed. Bone, he murmured. Bunter, fetch the envelope from my case. They sealed the fragments. Wimsey's mouth set in an unusual line of severity. He said nothing further until they returned to the parlour. There's no pet food, he said suddenly. My lord? No food for the cat, no tins, no saucers, not even a stray whisker. Elsie said Aristarchus sat at the window every afternoon. But there is no sign that any cat lived here at all. Doesn't that seem peculiar? Extremely, my lord. And if there was no cat, then who invented him? Bunter said nothing. Someone wanted a witness that could not speak. Something harmless to mention in a diary. Aristarchus tapped the pen. A charming, useless detail, but it confirms the diary was written in solitude, doesn't it? I see. Wimsey tapped his chin. No cat, no food, but she wrote of him regularly. Either Miss Forrest was delusional, or someone else wrote that diary page. Bunter's expression sharpened. You believe the entire last entry was fabricated? I do. And here is the twist, Bunter. If Miss Forrest was killed on Saturday, perhaps poisoned, perhaps suffocated, we must ask what happened afterwards. Someone arrived Sunday, read what she had written previously, and added one final page, just believable enough, just dull enough, to seem authentic. But they forgot about the ink. And they invented a cat. Bunter inclined his head. The niece? She would have motive, but I sense there's something theatrical about this. Something staged for a reader. And Ivy Forrest is not a dramatist. She's pragmatic. Wimsey stood and walked to the back door. The garden lay in stillness, faint bird calls threading through the hedges. He stepped out, boots soft on moss. Then he paused. There, just past the rose bushes, a wooden panel of the shed hung ajar. He approached. Inside, the gardener's tools were in precise rows, but a stack of old newspapers had been disturbed. Wimsey lifted one. Beneath it lay a pair of rubber gloves, lightly dusted with grey powder. And, tucked beneath a tarpaulin, a cat collar. It bore the name Aristarchus. Bunter, he said without turning. Summon Mr. Latchley. The gardener arrived in due course, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting suspiciously. Bit early. For questioning, my lord, I've work. Yes, I imagine so, said Wimsey, especially given how difficult it must be to keep a dead cat from smelling. Latchley went very still. I found the collar. In your shed. It's just a collar. Indeed. But Miss Forrest claimed her cat was alive and well on April 28th. Yet she also wrote that Mrs. D called again and used the phrase inherited shadow, which doesn't mean anything until you consider that you, Mr. Latchley, are not really Mr. Latchley, are you? The silence was absolute. You are in fact the son of Bernard Maddox, the solicitor ruined by Miss Forrest's testimony in 1904, the one who died in France. Latchley swallowed. He didn't die in France. That was a lie. He came back. Changed his name. I was born in 1917. And you, said Wimsey softly, took a job with Miss Forrest this January. You poisoned her on Saturday. On Sunday you staged the scene, wrote a final diary entry, added a cat that hadn't been seen in weeks, because she had written about him often, and you needed the illusion of continuity. But you burned the real final entries, the ones where she realized who you were. She destroyed him, Latchley whispered. My father. He was never the same. He was someone. Then she lied, said he'd forged the will. It wasn't true. She cost him everything. She believed she was protecting an inheritance from being stolen, said Wimsey, and perhaps she was wrong. But you became the shadow she wrote of, didn't you? Latchley stared at the floor. I just wanted her to feel fear, like he did. But you killed her. He said nothing. Bunter stepped forward. We should inform the police, my lord. Yes, said Wimsey quietly. Do see to it. Latchley made no attempt to run. He merely stood there, looking 10 years older. Later, as Wimsey sat again in the parlour, he opened the recovered diary. April 25th. Man in garden again. Notice the same strange lilt in his voice as Father Maddox used to have. Ridiculous, of course. April. 26. Cat missing 3 days. Latchley says foxes. Don't believe it. April 27th. If it is him, God help me, what have I inherited? He shut the diary. The past does write letters to the present, he murmured, but it's the reply that kills. Rain returned with theatrical timing, as though the clouds had merely paused to allow the arrest to proceed, uninterrupted. Lord Peter Wimsey, who had never minded rain unless it ran into his collar, stood just outside the Forest house beneath the shared cover of Bunter's umbrella, and watched as Mr. Latchley, now properly addressed as David Maddox, was led away by the village constable and a sergeant summoned from Dorchester. I don't know, Bunter, he said as the grey saloon pulled away with its cargo of justice and lineage, whether it's more melancholy or satisfying to unearth an avenger, whose motives are half tragedy, half Old Testament. Bunter, who never offered philosophical assessments unless asked, replied instead with, The collar, my lord, was what gave it away. Quite. There's a reason murderers shouldn't dabble in domestic detail. No tins of sardines, no scratches. On the furniture, no litter box. He might have got away with it if he'd claimed a canary. They turned back toward the house. The lock clicked as Wimsey secured the door one final time, and he pocketed the key with an absent gesture. There was no need to re-enter the scene. The performance was over and the curtain had fallen. The house itself had resumed its stillness, its secrets once again hidden beneath lace curtains and water-stained wallpaper. Yet something lingered. It wasn't until they had returned to the rose and teasel and the fire had been coaxed into reluctant life that Bunter cleared his throat with a slight emphasis that indicated a prepared observation. "If I may, my lord, there is one matter still unsettled." "Oh?" said Wimsey, stretching his legs toward the hearth. "Do tell." The question of Miss Ivy Forrest. Wimsey's eyes twitched upward beneath half-lowered lids. "Ah, our resilient niece. Yes, there is something unfinished there, isn't there?" The way she spoke, the absence of shock, the readiness, one might say, with which she assumed her aunt had died without reaching out. Cold, but not quite cold enough to accuse. "I hesitate, my lord, to suggest she was involved in the death, because she wasn't," said Wimsey calmly, "but she was involved in something." He rose, went to the writing desk by the window and removed a letter from the inside of his jacket. "Came this morning. From Ivy Forrest. She requested it be delivered via my chambers in London. Rather an old-fashioned move for someone who could have telephoned." He unfolded it and read aloud. "Dear Lord Wimsey, you were right, of course. I did find Aunt Anthea earlier than I said. Saturday evening, not Sunday. She was already dead. I panicked. Not because I feared the police, but because of the letter. She'd written one to me. Not in the diary, but as a private note. It wasn't kind. She accused me of betrayal, said I had conspired against her, sold something I had no right to. She referenced a manuscript, a bundle of letters from her youth, and accused me of offering them for publication. I hadn't, but I had read them. When I visited at Christmas, I came across the old trunk in her attic. I was curious. I copied a few excerpts. Perhaps I meant to show them to a friend at the press. I don't even remember now. When I found her dead, I remembered the note. I destroyed it. Burned it in the fireplace before I called anyone. I didn't want that accusation to be the last thing anyone read of her, or of me. That's all I did. I swear it. Yours sincerely, Ivy Forrest Bunter was silent for a long moment. "Do you believe her, my lord?" Wimsey folded the letter, slipping it back into its envelope with deliberate care. "Yes," he said finally. "And no. I believe she found the body. I believe she burned a note. But I don't believe she was as indifferent as she made herself out to be. I think she loved Miss Forrest in her way and hated her too. Old-fashioned English emotion. Controlled, self-suspicious, carefully buried under duty and commas." He turned back to the fire, stared into the thin flames. "There's an irony in it, Bunter. Miss Forrest kept a diary to preserve control. A neat, daily ritual, but the very thing that gave her peace became the vehicle for her killer. He knew she would have written in it. He forged her voice because he'd read her words. And if Miss Ivy hadn't interfered, hadn't burned that note, would it have helped? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But it might have told us how close. Miss Forrest had come to realizing who Latchley really was. Or, he paused, or it might have said something quite different. Something about legacy, about who gets to write the last word. A knock at the door interrupted the musing. The innkeeper's daughter appeared with a telegram on a small tray. Wimsey took it, opened it, and read with a faint smile. From Inspector, Parker, Scotland Yard Meadow alias. Latchley confessed under interrogation, claimed diary was only way to make her lie still. Notes manipulated to imply natural death. Claims cat was dead for weeks, says. She murdered father with pen. I used ink to bury her. Charming. Dear Charles, Wimsey said aloud, always a man of mood and metaphor. What a neat phrase. Ink to bury her. Rather overshadows the trial brief. I assume, said Bunter, there will now be a coroner's inquest, my lord. Yes, and doubtless a few shocked faces at the idea that diaries can deceive. But I think the jury will be satisfied. The motive is comprehensible. Revenge almost always is. The method, subtle, elegant, and utterly cruel, well, that is the stuff of novels or of Cuffnell St. Jude. He picked up his hat. And now, Bunter, we are done here. See to the bags. We'll take the North Road. I feel an appetite for something, unpoisoned and possibly Italian. As they drove out of the village, past the churchyard where Anthea Forrest would soon be laid to rest beneath a modest stone, Lord Peter Wimsey allowed himself a final glance in the rear-view mirror. "Do you know what troubles me, Bunter?" "No, my lord. She wrote every day, without fail, for years, until that one night. And what kills me, what truly gnaws, is not that she died. It's that someone presumed to write her final sentence for her." The Daimler picked up speed. "The dead ought to have the last word, Bunter, even if it's only April 28th, cloudy, lilacs wrong." Bunter inclined his head gravely. "Yes, my lord." The clouds behind them churned like spilt ink across the sky, and the road ahead wound on, dry at last, toward somewhere newer, stranger, and, one hoped, less literary in its methods of murder. The Me road stretched out in grey ribbons across the Dorset countryside, flanked by hedgerows still wet from the storm, and fields dotted with sheep too sensible to mind the weather. Inside the Daimler, Lord Peter Wimsey sat in thoughtful silence, one gloved finger tapping the leather armrest to a rhythm Bunter suspected belonged to either Purcell or a highly structured plan of vengeance. They had been driving for nearly an hour when Wimsey finally spoke. "It doesn't fit." Bunter, who had long since mastered the art of letting silence beckon elaboration, said nothing. Latchley, Wimsey continued, eyes on the road ahead, told Parker that the diary was the only way to make her lie still. Suggests a certain theatricality, don't you think? "Indeed, my lord. And the forgery of the final entry, well, yes, quite clever. But why bother at all? If you're willing to poison a woman and risk being seen at the scene, why add complexity?" "To deflect suspicion," Bunter offered. "True. But the complexity creates suspicion. Had he simply left her dead at the desk, the medical man might still have called it a stroke. The diary entry draws attention, and then there's the cat. Entirely invented. Exactly. Why invent a detail that invites contradiction? It adds flavor, certainly, but flavor is not necessary unless you're serving something. He fell silent again, this time until they passed through the village of Langford Newton, where a church tower tilted modestly toward a crooked pub. At last he turned toward Bunter. "There's more than revenge in this stew, Bunter. Something not yet stirred to the surface." Bunter, who had packed both an umbrella and a revolver, depending on which the case demanded, gave a brief nod. "Shall we detour, my lord?" Wimsey's mouth curled faintly. "We shall. I believe a visit to Miss Ivy Forrest, one more, would not be amiss. There's something about that letter. The phrase, 'She accused me of selling something I had.' No right to, too vague. And Miss Forrest, if you'll recall, was never vague, not in life, not on the page. Miss Forrest's flat in Lyme Regis had not changed. Still above the greengrocer, still suffering the decor crimes of the 1930s, but Ivy herself answered the door in a state of faint surprise, perhaps made sharper by the fact that she had not expected Lord Peter Wimsey to return after justice had seemingly been served. "Back again?" she said, stepping aside. "Have you forgotten something?" "Yes," said Wimsey, stepping over the threshold with the air of a visiting don. "I forgot to ask you what it was that you sold." She blinked. "The letter you sent me, it says, 'Your aunt accused you of selling something you had no right to.' A manuscript, you said, letters, but I don't quite believe that's all it was." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "You think I'm lying?" "I think you're withholding, a common enough pastime among the recently enriched." Ivy folded her arms. "You have no proof of anything." "I have a hunch," said Wimsey cheerfully, "and also access to the Dorchester Antiquarian Society, where a Mr. Peveril remembers a Miss Forrest, first name not given. inquiring about the sale of Victorian correspondence with a connection to the colonial judiciary in Calcutta. Her face froze. Your grandfather, I believe, was a judge there during the Raj. Rather a grim reputation. A scandal involving a Burmese interpreter. Never proven, but heavily insinuated. Your aunt likely kept his letters. Embarrassing ones. Perhaps even incriminating. Why would I sell them? For money or spite or both? I never sold them, she snapped. But you offered them, said Wimsey softly. You showed someone the letters, perhaps at a literary gathering or an editorial lunch, someone who knew their value, and somehow your aunt found out. She never confronted me about them. No, said Wimsey. She confronted you in writing, and you burned the note. But what if that note wasn't the only message? What if she revised her will again, privately, recently? What if the copy she kept in her desk, the one she never shared with Mr. Belling, revoked your inheritance entirely? Ivy turned pale. I don't know anything about that. Don't you? Then you won't mind if we ask the coroner to search the ashes, more carefully, because you burned something larger than a letter, Miss Forrest, something bound. Her voice, when it came, was low. She threatened to cut me off. She said the letters were a betrayal. She said I didn't deserve her name, her house, her money, that I was a visitor from the future with no sense of memory. And yes, I panicked. I found her dead, and I saw the new will. I knew what it meant. I burned it. I didn't kill her, but I couldn't bear to let her erase me. Not after everything. Wimsey nodded once. Thank you for your honesty. It's a rare currency, and it tends to inflate under pressure. Will you tell the police? He studied her. No. The primary crime, the murder, is solved. Your destruction of the will is despicable but not provable. And more importantly, it doesn't interest me nearly as much as this lingering question. Why did Latchley go to such elaborate lengths? Because he suspected you might arrive before the body was discovered. And he feared what you might find. It was not just Miss Forrest he wanted to silence. It was the feud, yours, his, all of it. A final punctuation mark, forged in ink. She looked away, hands trembling. I didn't want to inherit like this. But you did. And now you must decide what to do with it. Wimsey left without further comment. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and steady, like a clock chiming the hours neither cruelly nor kindly, simply because time, unlike sentiment, never stops. They reached the Daimler and settled in. Well, Bunter, Wimsey said as they pulled away from Lyme Regis, what have we learned? That the living are often more fearful than the dead, my lord. And that ink, said Wimsey, is rarely as indelible as guilt. He settled back, expression unreadable as the sea came into view, flat and grey and eternal. Somewhere inland, a trial would soon begin, and in a small churchyard, a new gravestone would be erected. But here, for the moment, the road continued, without interruption, and the rain, soft as breath, washed the dust from everything but memory. The road from Lyme Regis curved inland through sleepy hollows, and past barns leaning like old men after vespers, and Lord Peter Wimsey, his gloved, hands light upon the wheel, drove without speaking. Bunter, impeccably silent in the passenger seat, had long ago learned to leave him to these stretches of private rumination, wherein the tangled skeins of deception, motive, and unconsidered detail slowly loosened themselves into logical thread. At last, after nearly 10 miles and precisely 3 sheep crossings, Wimsey said, "We have a tidy resolution, Bunter." "So it would seem, my lord." "And yet—" "Yes, my lord?" "I dislike tidy resolutions. They imply either that the truth was straightforward from the beginning, which is rarely the case, or that someone has swept the untidy bits under the carpet and hopes no one notices the lump." Bunter offered no reply, though he glanced very slightly to his right, as if confirming the absence of metaphorical carpets in the Daimler. Wimsey continued. Miss Forrest's motive was clear: revenge for her father's disgrace. His identity was concealed, his methods elaborate. But Ivy, Forrest's story, that she destroyed the new will upon discovering her aunt's body, was an admission of desperation, not malice. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that someone else played a part, a quiet role, a backstage prompt. You suspect a third party, my lord. Not suspect, not yet, but I am uneasily aware of an absence, the kind that reveals itself only after. The curtain has fallen. They returned to Cuffnell St. Jude by mid-afternoon, a church bell tolling the hour in a subdued tenor. The Forrest house stood quiet, awaiting probate and emptiness. Wimsey did not approach it. Instead, he turned toward the narrow lane that led up behind the church and parked at the lich gate. Let's take a stroll, Bunter. I find exercise accelerates moral geometry. They passed through the churchyard, its stones etched with moss softened, names and dates: Phelps, Godfrey, Magdalen, Forrest, generations reduced to chiseled restraint. Wimsey paused at the largest headstone, a double plot with only one side filled: Henry Charles Forrest, 1862-1921. Anthea L. Forrest. Space. Left, she prepared the stone in advance, Wimsey murmured. Anticipated neatness even in death. He crouched, brushing a glove along the base. Look here, a faint scratch across the lower edge of the stone, half covered in lichen. A single word, hand-carved, not machine-cut like the rest. Liar. Recent, Wimsey said. Unprofessional but impassioned. Someone's done a bit of twilight chiseling. Bunter crouched to examine it. No initials, no flourish. No, but rage does not always decorate its work. Someone came here to speak their truth, though anonymously. We must ask, who would care enough to deface her grave, yet lack the courage to confront her in life? Latchley? Possible. But he left no such marks elsewhere, and his method was theatrical, not crude. This, Wimsey stood, was personal. They returned to the inn, and as Wimsey removed his hat, he turned to the landlord's daughter behind the bar. Miss Clara, may I trouble you for a village curiosity? Who in Cuffnell disliked Miss Forrest? Clara, a woman of 20 with a face more milkmaid than landlady, blinked, then leaned in confidentially. Well, my lord, you didn't hear it from me, but there was old Mrs. Delancey, said Miss Forrest. Interfered in her grandson's affairs, got him turned out of the grammar school, and the widow Tull said Miss Forrest borrowed a painting and never returned it. And then there was that row over the parish festival. What row? Oh, she had the vicar move it by a fortnight, so it wouldn't clash with her spring reading club. Made a fuss, said the festival encouraged vulgarity. Did it? Not particularly. Mostly sponge cake and slow music. Scandalous, said Wimsey. Did anyone confront her? Not openly, but Mrs. Delancey came down from London last month. She and her daughter, the one with the opera glasses, stayed 3 nights. Saw them walking past the Forrest house at dusk. Looked rather fixed. Ah, said Wimsey, I do love a good unresolved grievance. That evening he wrote 2 letters, one to Inspector Parker at Scotland Yard requesting background on the Delancey family, and one to the Dorchester Historical Register requesting documents related to the late Bernard Maddox's disbarment. He posted them, and retired with a copy of The Anatomy of Melancholy, noting with satisfaction that Burton's prose suited an evening spent among quiet ghosts. The reply from Parker arrived 2 days later. Delancey, Gerald, former grammar school student suspended in 1928 following allegations of inappropriate conduct. Testimony by a local lady, believed to be Anthea Forrest, triggered his expulsion, never charged. Family believes innocence. Delancey's mother Violet and grandmother Agnes have both spoken publicly against Forrest in past. No official threats. Wimsey read it twice. Now we have a motive without a method, he said, and a suspect with emotion but no opportunity. Unless, he turned to Bunter, we must find Mrs. Delancey. They tracked her to a tidy villa on the outskirts of Dorchester, surrounded by roses and painted signs warning against solicitor. For visits, Violet Delancey opened the door with a suspicious gaze and a pinched mouth. Lord Peter Wimsey, he said with his most apologetic bow. Might I speak with you on the matter of Miss Anthea Forrest? She's dead, said Violet, and deservedly so. Ah, said Wimsey, may I come in? Reluctantly she allowed it. The sitting room was stifling and smelled faintly of soap and loss. Her mother, Mrs. Agnes Delancey, sat in a chair near the fire, staring with wet eyes and a fixed expression. She ruined my son, said Violet. Testified behind closed doors, had him expelled. The school said it was a character concern, never named it, but everyone knew. She said he was inappropriate with language, and he was a boy. Did she ever speak to you afterwards? No. Never apologized, never admitted it. We came to the village once a year, walked past her house, thought she might show shame. She never did. Did you ever threaten her? Not openly. Did you see her in the past month? No. She died of poisoning. But her death was arranged to look peaceful. Forged diary entries, invented details. One of those details, her fictional cat, was mentioned in a letter she wrote to the vicar's wife. A slip. Violet's eyes narrowed. She had no cat. I know, said Wimsey gently. But someone else knew she wrote about one, and someone else knew enough of her private habits to forge them. Someone else with access to her house. Mrs. Delancey finally spoke. She never locked the back gate, she said. Wimsey turned. Pardon? She kept the side gate open for the gardener. You could walk straight in. I used to see him leave it swinging. Wimsey leaned forward. Did you enter the house? Agnes Delancey stared at the fire. I did. When? Sunday morning I wanted to see her. I had a dream that she'd finally written to apologize, that maybe she was ill, that something had changed. And what did you find? She was cold in the chair, already gone. And what did you do? I panicked. I straightened things. I didn't want anyone to think we had done it. I may have moved the diary. I don't remember. I just wanted her to look like she had died with dignity. It was petty, I know. I didn't kill her, but You tidied the scene. She nodded. And the word on the gravestone. Violet shifted. That was me. Wimsey stood. Thank you for your honesty. Outside, he lit a cigarette and leaned on the gate. Bunter, he said quietly. Latchley staged the death. Ivy destroyed the will. The Delanceys accidentally shaped the scene further, and each believed they were alone. Bunter considered this. A mosaic of guilt, my lord. Indeed, said Wimsey. Truth is rarely tidy, but this is more than untidy. It's a palimpsest of petty revenge and edited legacy, a house of mirrors. He exhaled slowly. And poor Miss Forrest, so desperate for control that she built her whole life on routine, was finally undone, not by hatred, but by other people's unfinished stories. He tossed the cigarette. Come, Bunter. I believe it's time for a brandy and a quotation, possibly both at once. They returned to the Rose and Teasel late that afternoon, the kind of hour when tea has gone tepid. The post has been collected, and the villagers have already begun thinking with quiet satisfaction about supper. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, was not a man easily subdued by clockwork customs or warm puddings. He swept into the parlour with a storm of coat and intent, his eyes bright beneath his brows, and his mind, clearly, in full gallop. Bunter, long attuned to the signs, had already rung for coffee. I suppose, said Wimsey, warming his hands, by the hearth. that what truly amazes me, Bunter, is not the individual trespasses. They're banal, quite tediously human. It's the entanglement. Each actor believing themselves alone, unique in their wrongdoing, when in truth they were building a monument together, one falsehood stacked on another, until the body lay like a kind of accusation against all of them. Yes, my lord, consider it. Latchley, Maddox sought revenge and poetic justice. Ivy Forrest feared disinheritance and destroyed a document in a panic. Mrs. Delancey entered the house, touched the scene, perhaps even unwittingly arranged it. And then there is the matter of that forged diary entry, which increasingly strikes to me as being too subtle for Latchley's hand. Bunter blinked. My lord? Latchley was clever, yes, but he was not intimate with Miss Forrest's writing. Not intimately enough to mimic her style, the cadence, the punctuation, the slight irregularity in her T's. That takes time, study, practice. Miss Ivy Forrest, then? Possible. She had opportunity, knowledge. But the style is wrong. For her. She's precise, mechanical. The forged entry is more impressionistic. There's a rhythm to it. Almost literary. Bunter considered this. You think someone else wrote it? I know someone else wrote it. Someone who had read her diary before. Someone who was close enough to borrow her phrasing without copying it. Someone who... The door opened, and a tentative head poked in. "Telegram for Lord Wimsey," said the innkeeper's daughter. Wimsey took it with thanks, tore the envelope. Neatly, and read from Peveril, Dorset Historical Register. Forrest family records confirmed Bernard Maddox disbarment, 1904. Stemmed from anonymous letter of accusation. Never verified. Judge in case. Charles Everett Forrest, relation to victim cousin. Anthea Forrest involved indirectly. Possible suppression of letters by family order. Wimsey let the paper drop slightly in his hand. Bunter, he said slowly, it appears our dearly departed Miss Forrest may not have been the origin of her family's secrets, merely their curator. The real poison, figuratively and literally, began with Charles Everett Forrest, her cousin, the colonial judge. Alive. Or deceased, my lord. Alive when last recorded, retired, Cheltenham, do you recall? Yes, my lord. Estate listed under his name in the solicitor's records. Then it is time, I think, to pay a visit to Cousin Charles, for if someone feared Miss Forrest might speak ill of the dead, or publish something long buried, they might have seen her death as a necessity, not vengeance, not fear, prevention. Cheltenham, that quiet and respectable retreat for the gently decaying upper middle class, lay under a veil of drizzle when they arrived the next morning. The house they sought, Mallowcrest, stood at the end of a cul-de-sac with a high iron gate and an aura of scrubbed denial. A maid opened the door and eyed them warily, until Lord Peter's card produced a transformation more powerful than alchemy. They were ushered through a corridor of sepia hunting prints into a drawing-room so dustless it felt padded. Colonel Charles Everett Forrest appeared precisely 4 minutes later. He was a tall man of about 70, military to the fingertips, with eyes like 2 polished coins and a moustache that refused compromise. He offered no hand. Lord Peter, I'm told you're investigating Anthea's death. Indeed, said Wimsey. May I offer condolences? They're unnecessary. We were not close. Anthea and I had diverging views of morality. She believed, in guilt by association. I in honor preserved. Curious that honor required disinheriting you. The colonel's moustache stiffened. She was impulsive in later years. You know, I've always wondered, Wimsey said, wandering slightly toward the bookshelves, how one forgets a scandal. Not in the sense of public memory, that's easily handled, but personal scandal, family disgrace, hidden letters, accusations that are never made formally, yet ruin careers. The colonel's gaze was flint. You presume a great deal. I presume, said Wimsey, that someone, perhaps Anthea, had access to correspondence capable of reviving an old shame, and that someone else had reason to keep her from releasing it. The forged diary entry, you see, was written by someone who understood her voice, not just her words, but the space between them. And who better than a family member with decades of letters to draw from? You're accusing me? I'm asking you, did you forge the entry? Colonel Forrest turned away, facing the fire. I wrote it, he said, not turning back. But I did not kill her. Wimsey inclined his head. Why? She wrote to me, said she had finally decided to release our grandfather's papers, that she no longer cared for reputation, said she would publish everything in spring. She was always dramatic, but I believed her. And so you visited her. I did, Sunday morning. She was already dead. And you forged the entry. To protect what little remains of our name, I wrote a few lines, enough to suggest she died writing the trivialities she clung to. Then I left. You didn't call the police? No, I assumed someone else would. I wasn't thinking clearly. And did you remove anything? He hesitated. Yes, a packet of letters, old. I burned them that night. Wimsey nodded. So Latchley killed her. Ivy destroyed the will. The Delanceys rearranged the scene, and you gave her false last words. The colonel turned, suddenly tired. Is it any worse than the truth? No, said Wimsey softly. Only more dishonest. They took their leave in silence. As they drove away, Wimsey sat with his chin resting lightly on one hand. It's astonishing, Bunter, my lord, that 4 people, all unknown to each other, intervened in one death. None with the same motive, none with the same goal, yet all working in concert to obliterate the truth. A sort of unconscious conspiracy, my lord. Exactly. Each one believing themselves protector, executor, avenger, or witness. Yet in the end, Miss Forrest vanished beneath the weight of everyone else's version of her. He sighed, deeply. And that, Bunter, is the tragedy. She left no final words, only edits. Bunter made no reply, but the road back to Cuffnell St. Jude seemed longer now, and the trees more bare. The final days of April had ended, as if by design, with Miss Anthea Forrest. But the aftershocks of her passing continued to ripple through Cuffnell St. Jude with that particularly English form of gossip, low volume, high precision, and invariably disguised as sympathy. Lord Peter Wimsey, who had no particular fondness for sentiment when untethered from logic, now found himself back at the Forest House, not to exhume new secrets, but to conclude them. He stood in the study, that too-neat room where it had all begun, the blotter, the pen, the invented diary entry, the imagined cat. The curtains, which someone had carefully drawn open that fateful morning to let in the light, or rather to suggest the passage of morning, now hung heavy and untouched. Dust had returned to the skirting boards. Absence had made itself at home. Bunter, behind him, carried a small stack of items, the salvaged diary, now preserved in protective wrap, a few charred fragments of a secondary will, and a sealed envelope containing the typed confession of Colonel Charles Everett Forrest. Wimsey set a hand on the writing desk, fingers resting lightly on its polished edge. She was murdered, he said softly, by a man seeking revenge. Yes, my lord. Unknowingly abetted by a niece who feared poverty. Yes. Whose actions were muddled further by an old woman looking for a semblance of grace. Yes. And whose legacy, her truth, was overwritten by a cousin trying to erase a scandal buried before the war. Yes, my lord. Wimsey exhaled slowly. And yet, when the coroner's report is published, it will likely say death by digitalis administered by unknown party, with the rest consigned to speculation and rumor. The diary, the will, the letters, all. Gone or tainted? Bunter cleared his throat discreetly. Your efforts will not go unnoticed. Wimsey gave a half-smile. Bunter, do you know what Miss Forrest was most afraid of? I believe, my lord, she feared irrelevance. Exactly. She kept a diary not out of vanity but defiance. She wanted to matter, even in the margins, but the irony is cruel. Because what remains now is a fiction. Her own words, her habits, her order, used by others to protect themselves. She left no final thought unaltered. He stepped away from the desk. I detest forgeries. Not for their deception, but for the way they co-opt another's voice. A good lie sounds more like the victim than the truth ever does. He turned. Come, Bunter. There is one more person who deserves to hear it all. They did not return to London, nor to Scotland Yard, but instead to Dorchester once again, to the small tidy clinic where Ivy Forrest worked behind a desk, her days now populated with patient files and the slow, unglamorous ticking of medical bureaucracy. She greeted them with wariness that barely masked resignation. "Have you come to arrest me?" she asked quietly, gesturing them into a staff room lined with kettles and broken chairs. "No," said Wimsey, removing his gloves. "We've come to offer you clarity, whether or not you want it." She sat. "Then say what you've come to say." Wimsey, standing, looked down at her with no triumph, only tiredness. "You were not alone. Not in your trespass." Latchley. "Poisoned your aunt, yes, but others shaped her death as much as you did." Mrs. Delancey rearranged the scene. "Colonel Forrest forged the final diary entry, and you burned the new will." "I know what I did," she said, not meeting his eye. "Do you? Because I wonder whether you understand the pattern. Each of you tried to protect something. For Latchley it was his father's name, for the Delanceys their son's dignity, for your cousin the family reputation, for you— What was it, Ivy? Survival? Validation? I didn't want her to define me. And yet, she still has." She looked up sharply. "She controlled everything," Ivy said. "Who received letters, who didn't, who got mentioned in the diary. She curated life like it was an archive. Only the parts that made her look composed were kept." Wimsey regarded her for a long moment. "Do you know why the diary ended on April 28th? Because she died. No, because someone else stopped it. Someone else wrote the final page. Your aunt may have intended to write more, may even have written more that was later destroyed. But the last thing she ever chose to write wasn't what she was remembered for. It was overwritten." He took the diary from Bunter and placed it before her. "This is a forgery, not by you, not even by the killer, but by your family." Ivy opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the final entry. The neat slope of the words she had assumed were her aunt's. "She never used a semicolon," she whispered. "Not once. She always said it was a punctuation mark for people who couldn't commit." Wimsey nodded. "The person who forged it didn't know that, but you did." She closed the book. Her hands trembled. "So what happens now?" "That depends on you," said Wimsey. "You've inherited a house and estate, possibly guilt, but you also inherited absence, a blank space where the truth should be. I can't bring her back. No, but you can stop pretending this was tidy." She looked away. "I don't know how." Wimsey stood. "Start with a diary. Not hers, yours." As they stepped outside into the clean brightness of a spring afternoon, Bunter observed, "You believe she'll write it, my lord?" "I don't know," Wimsey replied. "But it's what Miss Forrest would have hated most, being corrected by her successor." He paused beside the car, drawing in a breath touched faintly with lavender and iron. "We've pulled the curtain aside, Bunter, and revealed that the stage was crowded all along, that death is never solitary, and grief is never simple. Yes, my lord, and we've learned that a woman's final words were chosen not by her, but by everyone who needed her to say something." He opened the door and slipped into the Daimler. "There's something fundamentally indecent about that." Bunter nodded gravely, shutting the door behind him. They drove in silence, leaving Cuffnell St. Jude behind at last. It would return to itself quickly. It always did. The villagers would remember Miss Forrest as peculiar, proud and orderly to a fault. They would forget the shadowed visitors, the disputed diary, the letters, the gate left open, the forged final page. They would forget, because forgetting is simpler than remembering that the dead are often unfinished people, made complete only by the convenience of others. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, did not forget. He carried the story with him not as a triumph, but as an ellipsis, a case solved, but a life unfinished. They arrived in London under a pale, rattling sky, the kind of afternoon where the Thames looked like tarnished pewter, and the air carried the scent of soot and endings. Lord Peter Wimsey said very little, as Bunter drove them through familiar streets, past shops with drawn blinds and clerks returning late from lunch. The city, eternal and unmoved by rural tragedy, welcomed him back with indifference, but Wimsey did not mind indifference. He found it clarifying. By the time they reached 110A Piccadilly, he had shed the country mud, the village ghosts, and the lingering scent of lavender oil that clung to Miss Forrest's desk like an accusation. He ascended the stairs, coat swinging, and paused at his library door, not to admire the books which were already alphabetized and dusted, but to listen. Silence. His kind of silence. The kind full of memory and logic rather than regret. Inside he found a letter waiting. He recognized the paper before the handwriting, Ivy Forrest. He opened it at his desk, aware of Bunter moving soundlessly in the room beyond, and read, Dear Lord, Wimsey, I've begun the diary, not because I think anyone will ever read it, but because I need somewhere to place the things I've never said aloud. I understand now what my aunt was trying to do. She wasn't documenting events. She was containing them, controlling their shape. She wrote the world smaller than it was so she could feel safe in it. I don't know whether I'll stay in Cuffnell St. Jude. I don't know if I can. Every room in that house reminds me of something I thought I'd hidden. But I won't sell it yet. That would feel too much like getting away with something. Thank you for giving me the whole story. Even the parts I didn't want, especially those yours, Ivy Forrest. He sat for a while after finishing the letter, not thinking precisely, just allowing the facts to settle again. They had been shaken loose by a sequence of events he could now recite backwards. The forged diary, the invented cat, the missing will, the legacy of a disbarred man, the quiet rearrangements of guilt. Each player had believed themselves the protagonist, but the stage had been far too crowded for a single hero. It was in the end an ensemble piece, and Anthea Forrest, prim and exacting, had been given not a voice but a script, written posthumously by her survivors. Wimsey reached for a volume from the shelf. Tacitus, Latin always helped, but as he opened it, he paused and spoke aloud, more to the room than to himself. She died writing. All thought she would, and in the end it didn't matter what she'd intended to say, the world wrote over her. Bunter appeared with a tray. Brandy, my lord. Wimsey took the glass, but did not drink. He stared at the amber liquid for a moment, then said, Do you know, Bunter, I once thought truth was a matter of elimination. Remove the impossible and so forth. But what they don't tell you is that the impossible is often simply undocumented. Indeed, my lord. I now find myself wondering how many truths have been quietly incinerated. Not by villains, but by frightened people with matches and motives. There are always more truths than historians can house, my lord. Wimsey sipped. We solved a murder, Bunter, but we uncovered a, what shall we call it, a palimpsest. A kind of social archaeology. 4 trespasses, none coordinated, all focused on the same quiet woman. Yes, my lord. And all of them believing they were alone in the room with her ghost. He stood and wandered to the window, looking down at Piccadilly. The bustle of afternoon cabs, the cries of a newspaper boy, the orderly collapse of Another London day. Latchley, he said after a moment, wanted revenge. Ivy wanted security. The Delanceys wanted dignity. Charles Forrest wanted silence. Each was justified, in their own eyes. Most are, my lord. But their justifications collectively obliterated Anthea Forrest. He turned from the window. Do you know what I keep returning to? No, my lord. The cat. Bunter raised a brow. Aristarchus. Exactly. The cat that never existed. The cat whose name filled pages of Miss Forrest's diary, who supposedly tapped the pen, who curled on her windowsill, and yet whom no one could recall ever seeing. A literary invention, my lord. No, said Wimsey slowly. A cover story, a misdirection, a trick so petty and so precise that it disguised a forgery better than any flourish ever could. And it worked. He crossed to the hearth and dropped into the chair. It worked, Bunter. The coroner's report will say digitalis, but the narrative, the thing that survives, is a lie. And most of the village will believe it, not because they're fools, but because they prefer a version of the world where people die quietly, with cats at their feet, and nothing unpleasant happens behind locked parlor doors. Comfort is a powerful sedative, my lord. It is, Wimsey agreed. But truth, truth is a stimulant, bitter, necessary, and sometimes fatal. He set down his brandy, unopened. I think I shall write to Ivy again, encourage her to publish what she remembers, not what was written. Let her correct the forgery, even if the village won't thank her for it. Yes, my lord. And perhaps I'll write something too, a little piece for the Spectator, on the ethics of the final entry. Not that anyone reads such things, but it might please my conscience. He stood, stretching. Come, Bunter, let us have supper. I feel the need for something insufferably French, and afterwards perhaps something German and tragic at the opera. Very good, my lord. As they left, Wimsey cast one last glance at the shelf where the diary had briefly rested before being passed to Ivy. The real one, the one before the edits. He said nothing, but his expression was as sharp and melancholic as a violin left echoing in an empty hall. Behind him the fire sputtered softly in the grate. A life had ended in April. But the truth, like spring, was not content to stay buried. And so Lord Peter Wimsey, having solved a murder not by uncovering what was hidden, but by restoring what had been erased, stepped out into the London evening, where the rain had finally ceased, and the city breathed once more in unwritten sentences. 1 month later, in the understated hush of the Senior Bookmen's Club on St. James's Street, Lord Peter Wimsey sat at his preferred corner table beneath the carved wooden bust of Sir Thomas Browne, and scribbled the final sentence of an article titled The Inheritance of Silence, Reflections on the Diary as Evidence. He put down his pen with a sigh, not of exhaustion but of complicated completion. Beside him, a thin sheaf of typed pages lay clipped and addressed to the Spectator. He would not sign it with his full name. Merely PSW, a minor joke. On anonymity and authorship, one Miss Forrest would have appreciated. Across the table, Inspector Parker stirred his tea and watched him. "Well," said Parker, "I've read your draft. Laudably restrained. Not one overt dig at the magistrate." Wimsey gave a modest shrug. "I'm attempting maturity. It chafes. Will you tell me why you really wrote it?" "To remind myself," Wimsey replied, "that solving a crime and understanding it are separate disciplines. We apprehended the man who administered the poison, but the motive wasn't solitary. Everyone thought they had good reason to tamper with her death. That, Charles, is far more dangerous than a single wicked act. That's consensus. It creates its own innocence." Parker sipped, thoughtful. "Ivy Forrest's diary was published, I hear. A private edition, 70 copies, just enough to bruise the village." "Yes, She left in May, sold the house, gave the proceeds to a foundation for victims of wrongful accusations, made no public statements. Quite tasteful, really. No memoirs, no interviews, just a small postscript in the Times that read, Miss Forrest leaves behind no surviving relatives and one unverified cat. Parker chuckled. Fitting. And Colonel Charles Forrest, dead, 2 weeks after our last visit. Heart failure. No funeral. Just a solicitor and a sealed trunk labelled, to be burned unread. How poetic, murmured Wimsey. Even in death he edited himself. They lapsed into companionable silence. Around them, the rustling of newspapers and the faint clink of porcelain formed the soundtrack of a world that preferred its troubles tidied away, alphabetized, and preferably out of sight. Wimsey rose at last, stretching. I've an appointment with a librarian in Bloomsbury who insists she's found a first edition of The Anatomy of Melancholy, annotated in marginalia by a suicidal bishop. I find it irresistible. Parker laughed. Only you would consider theological despair light. Reading, Wimsey grinned. Ah, but it's better than forgeries. At least the bishop knew his ending. As he gathered his gloves and hat, Parker said, One more thing, Wimsey. Why did you take the case at first, I mean? It wasn't yours. Wimsey paused, his expression unreadable. Because the diary stopped in April. And it shouldn't have. He adjusted his cuffs, turned on his heel and departed with the crisp assurance of a man who, having faced the worst in others, still hoped for something decent in print. Outside, London carried on. The rain had turned to a thin mist. Pedestrians bustled, the newsboys shouted, and in a quiet corner of Bloomsbury, a librarian waited beside a book that hadn't been opened in 100 years, its spine intact, its story undisturbed. Lord Peter. Wimsey walked into the afternoon with a smile not of satisfaction, but of resignation. Justice, he knew, was not always the triumphant clang of the gavel. Sometimes it was merely the restoration of truth, a scratched-out line reinserted at the foot of the page, even if no one wanted to read it. And so it ended. Not with a bang, nor even a cry, but with a closing line written by no murderer, no cousin, no niece, just time, and a truth that refused finally to be edited.